Over the last 3 decades, Superman has taken a lot of heat. People said he's boring, not fun to watch because he's way too powerful, or that his look just feels outdated. The character's image was a mess, but James Gunn fixed it by pulling the best parts from different comic versions to give us a new Superman that gets past all those issues. The first problem is that a big part of the audience thinks Superman is boring because he doesn't feel like a real flesh and blood person. Since he's not human, he's not relatable like Spider-Man, who has family and money problems just like everyone else. This misconception goes back to the 60s and 70s, when Donner showed Reeves' Superman as an incorruptible figure who never made mistakes. Instead of being a regular guy who just happened to have powers, Superman was a role model who didn't share the same worries as the rest of us. In Superman 2, he told his mom that he was dying to hook up with Lois Lane because she was the love of his life, almost like he was asking for permission. But his mom told him that if he wanted to enjoy the pleasures of mortals, he had to live like one and give up his powers. According to Donner and Lester's vision, Superman wasn't allowed to have a normal life and also be a superhero. This worked back then to sell the idea of Superman as an icon, someone we should look up to. We weren't supposed to relate to Superman, but rather be inspired by him, to wish we could be like him one day. With some minor differences, we saw the same idea done really well in All-Star Superman and Doomsday Clock, where Superman literally inspires the whole universe throughout history. But only a handful of writers can actually pull this off while also telling a good superhero story. Also, this version doesn't really click with today's world, where people are depressed, disillusioned, and cynical because this Superman feels way too far removed from the average person. He's a god dressed as a human who's never really going to be one of us.
Boring.
But Gunn flipped this around and made Superman a human with godlike powers. This difference is super clear in the interview scene at Lois's apartment. Clark explains he stepped into the Baravian conflict because a lot of innocent people were going to die, and he just couldn't let that happen. He didn't think about informing the US government because it would have been a waste of time, and he doesn't need anyone's permission to save lives. He also argues that his involvement shouldn't be some big international scandal because he wasn't representing the United States. He was representing himself, and the idea of doing good. This new Superman still defends the classic values, since Reeves' version also didn't answer directly to any government. But at the same time, Corenswet's Superman gets frustrated when Lois pushes back and tells him maybe he was wrong to jump into a complicated international conflict that had been going on for years. Clark gets mad, yells when Lois brings up the hashtag supershit, and ends up walking out of the interview because he feels uncomfortable. He can't handle people challenging his values in such a cynical way. And he can't just charm his way through every problem with a smile, like Reeves' Superman could. In this scene, Clark has a normal argument with his partner, something that could happen to anyone. Sure, you probably didn't land on Earth in a spaceship and can't lift 200 quintillion tons, but chances are you've had a heated argument with someone you care about over something you were absolutely sure you were right about.
People were going to die!
Gunn's Superman is still the same superhero we know when he's in the suit, but now we can relate to him because he's got the same problems as any regular person. This is way harder to pull off than it looks, because this Superman doesn't rely on the cliche of struggling to balance his personal life and superhero duties. That would have just turned him into Spider-Man or Invincible, at least like in the early part of the Invincible comics. But this Supes feels like a much more grounded hero. He says out loud that he enjoys a cup of coffee, gets mad when his dog gets kidnapped, and talks about what kind of music he likes, just like anyone would in a normal conversation. These little details make us see Superman as a person who happens to have powers, and not as some messianic figure destined to save humanity just because his parents wanted him to. This version moves away from the idealistic and religious take on Superman, but he's still inspiring because he's a hero who always tries to do the right thing. We see that in the battle against the kaiju in the middle of Metropolis. The Justice Gang takes it down to avoid civilian casualties, but Superman says he wanted to restrain it alive and take it to an intergalactic zoo because it was just a confused creature that didn't want to hurt anyone. And sure, I know James Gunn wasn't the one who came up with the idea of humanizing Superman. Mark Waid already did it back in 2003 in Superman Birthright when he retold his origin. And in the Public Enemies arc, Jeff Loeb had Batman describe him as the most human of all, even though he could shoot lasers from his eyes and looked like a god. But Gunn took inspiration from these writers to bring that human version of Superman to the big screen, something we'd never seen done before.
Good for him, man.
The second problem Gunn had to fix was Superman's design, which is one of the most controversial aspects of the character. There are hardcore fans of the Big Blue who want to see him in a colorful suit with his classic red trunks, because that's always been his look in the comics. But another group of fans thinks the design just doesn't make sense, because nobody wears their underwear on the outside, and it doesn't serve any practical purpose. After all, the only reason Superman looked like that in the first place is because his design was based on the strongmen of the 1930s, the equivalent of today's bodybuilders. Back then, if If you saw a guy wearing his underwear outside his outfit, you knew that dude was supposed to be strong, which is why all the heroes of that time had a similar design. But that's so outdated now that no other superhero has that kind of design in live action. The Daredevil we saw in She-Hulk wore a suit with the same colors as his first appearance, but they ditched the trunks. And the same thing happened with every Batman adaptation over the last 20 years. They gave him armor because it made sense for him to wear a Kevlar suit to survive fights with mobsters. And they also dropped the trunks because they didn't match. This carried over to Superman. Fearing casual audiences would reject seeing a grown man in underwear, several directors updated his look. In Man of Steel and Superman and Lois, Supes wears a belt, but no trunks. The same thing happened in the New 52, when Jim Lee gave him a kind of Kryptonian armor with a high collar. On top of that, starting around 2010, Superman's suit stopped being as colorful as it was in the comics. His design started to look more like MCU suits, which have pretty muted colors, to make them feel more like combat armor, instead of the classic spandex costumes. You can't deny they look more realistic and believable, but they're not as bright or distinctive as the original designs.
I have to admit, I'm still getting used to the new look.
But while people were more or less fine with the MCU suits, Superman's redesign didn't sit well with everyone. That's why they brought back the trunks in the comics, and also in My Adventures with Superman. So Gunn had to make both groups happy, and to do that, he went with a mix of ideas. He gave Superman a classic look, just like many comic fans wanted, bringing back the yellow S on the cape, the red trunks, and the bright blue suit. But he also added the lines and collar from the New 52, so it would feel more like a Kryptonian suit instead of just a diving outfit. To make sure it didn't look silly or clash with the tone of the movie, Gunn had to adjust the whole vibe of the film so it would feel natural for Superman to dress like this. The new DCU has a more comic book-like style compared to the MCU, the old DCU, or Nolan's Batman, because it never tries to look like a copy of the real world. The characters might deal with human problems we can all relate to, and there are even bot farms and social media attacks. But there are also made-up cities and pocket universes. Plus, people in Metropolis are used to kaijus and metahumans popping up everywhere. Therefore, Superman wearing his trunks on the outside doesn't surprise anyone, because it's the least weird thing happening in the whole movie. He doesn't look like a clown who put his suit on backwards, and nobody laughs at him because his design fits the movie's tone. Now, before you come at me, I'm not saying this is the ultimate Superman design. I wasn't sold on the suit at first when the early photos came out, but in the movie, it works perfectly. Still, I'm not the biggest fan of all the lines everywhere, and personally, I wish the suit fit a little tighter, even if Cornsweat had to wear a muscle suit like Cavill did in Man of Steel. But those are small details that don't ruin the overall look of the character, which brings back all the classic elements without making him look ridiculous.
Love the new outfit.
The third problem Gunn had to solve was Superman's power level. A lot of people say the character is boring because he's just way too powerful and can solve any situation, so his stories don't have any real stakes. This problem goes all the way back to the Silver Age, when he could shoot tiny Supermen from his fingers or drag an entire solar system with his bare hands. A ton of writers made Superman basically invincible, giving him random powers on the spot so he could literally do anything. He could erase Lois's memory with a kiss, or rebuild a wall just by looking at it. That kind of thing helps patch up any plot holes and makes Superman look like the ultimate hero who can do it all. But it also makes the story super boring, because unless you throw in kryptonite, magic, or a red sun, Superman can just breeze through any challenge without breaking a sweat. Gunn knew this from the start. Before the movie came out, he said in a Rolling Stone interview that to make this Superman work for everyone, he had to make him feel vulnerable and beatable in a fight. The tricky part was doing that without nerfing him, or making Superman look like a pushover, because then the character would lose all his appeal. The middle ground Gunn landed on was giving his Superman a power level similar to the post-crisis version from the comics. But at the same time, his enemies use his weaknesses in really creative ways, which we see in 3 different scenes.
Why don't you prove it?
The first scene comes right at the start of the movie, when we find out that Superman lost his first battle in 3 years against the Hammer of Baravia. At that moment, we don't know the details, but later we find out this guy is a clone of Superman who, according to his creator, is even stronger than the original. On top of that, Luthor spent years studying Superman and memorized all his moves. He came up with 2,500 different techniques to hit every single one of Superman's weak spots. He took advantage of the fact that this version of the Man of Steel isn't exactly a trained fighter. It makes sense that Ultraman can beat him multiple times because he's just as strong, or even stronger, and he actually knows how to fight. This is one of Superman's weak points that barely ever gets brought up. Superman might be one of the most powerful beings in the universe, but in most versions, he's never really been trained to fight at the same level as Batman or Wonder Woman. Most of the time, he doesn't need to, since he's way stronger than his enemies, but if he's up against someone just as strong as he is, he needs to be the better fighter to win. This only comes up in a handful of comics, like in the Our Worlds at War arc, when Mongul trains him so he can take on Imperiex. It's also also briefly mentioned in Man of Steel, when Zod tells him he's trained his whole life to control his senses, and that Superman fights like a farm boy. But with Corrin Sweat's Superman, it's crystal clear he struggles against his clone, because he's not as skilled in combat. That's something he's gonna have to work on.
Oh, you are such a wuss.
The second time his weaknesses get used against him is when Metamorpho uses kryptonite to keep him in check. Since he's exposed to it for hours, Superman ends up poisoned and can barely stand. Even after Metamorpho gives him artificial sunlight, he never fully regains his strength and struggles to take on Lex's men at the Anti-Proton River. This scene is both fun and tense, because Superman has to keep Metamorpho's kid away from the deadly river while also taking down several of Lex's guys. If he were fully recovered, getting out of the river and handling those goons wouldn't be a problem. But Gunn uses his weakened state to make it feel like both Superman and the baby are in real danger. And the third time his weaknesses are exploited is in the third act, when the engineer uses her nanites to suffocate him. This version of Superman is still invulnerable to almost any physical damage and can hold his breath for hours, but he still needs air in his lungs. So the engineer goes in through his mouth and fills his lungs with nanites, choking him from the inside. The nanites also get into his optic nerve to shut down his vision and all his eye powers, leaving him unable to face the engineer or Ultraman in a fight because he can't even see them. This forces Superman to rely on his brain to survive the stadium brawl, since he doesn't get any outside help and can't physically remove the nanites himself. The way he solves it is by flying up to the atmosphere to clear the nanites from his face, and then plummeting back down, so the impact knocks the rest of them out of his body. The scene works because it makes us feel like Superman could lose, and Luthor even makes this face when he thinks he's won.
I am so happy.
But that doesn't mean Gunn's Superman is a pushover. Even if he gets knocked around as much as Invincible, he's not nerfed at all. He can be vulnerable to very specific attacks, but he still lifts entire buildings and wipes out Luthor's whole army in 15 seconds. He's kind of like the Justice League Unlimited Superman, who admits to Darkseid that he has to hold back every day, or he could accidentally kill someone. This really stands out in the kaiju scene. Superman could take down the creature with a single hit, but since they're in the middle of the city, he can't just toss this thing around, because it would crush dozens of buildings and kill thousands of people. Every time he lands a hit, he has to make sure the kaiju doesn't crash into a building. Because of that, he can't use his full strength to deal with the threat quickly, since that would put innocent lives at risk. It's clear he's insanely strong, but maybe his biggest weakness is that he wants to save everyone. So we've got a Superman who upholds the classic values, looks straight out of the comics, and is just as powerful, yet can still be beaten in a fight. With this reinvention of the character, Gunn managed to make everyone love the new Superman and gave the character a fresh boost in popularity. Believe it or not, the Big Blue has had plenty of rough patches over his 47 years in movie history. I'll tell you all about it in this video.
That's all for today.